Hi there, my name is Katie Saints. I'm a lead therapist from Fox Valley Autism. Today's video is talking about dual diagnoses. What I'd like to do is go through and talk about common diagnoses that are also diagnosed with autism. But to start, I want to define the diagnostic criteria for autism. So to start with, autism has a social skills deficits. The social skill deficits can be rooted in emotional reciprocity, so understanding other people's emotions, understanding their own emotions, interpreting nonverbal skills or nonverbal communication. There's difficulties in maintaining and understanding relationships, relationship rules, other people's feelings, and interactions. Additionally, there's repetitive movements, speech, behavior, things like that that are persistent and repetitive. There's inflexibility and an insistence on things staying the same. There's fixated interests at intense levels. There's hyper or hypo sensitivity to sensory things. So they're either oversensitive or undersensitive to different sensory situations. One thing I'd really like to point out about autism and any disorder really is that it doesn't look the same on any one person. There's a common saying in the autism world that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So, as we describe these symptoms, everybody has them on a spectrum. So, some people have an extreme version of that, and some people have a mild version of that. Additionally, while these are listed as diagnostic criteria and symptoms, they can be used and turned into a good thing. For example, the fixated interests. Oftentimes, adults with autism turn those things into careers, and that's part of how they become successful. So, as I go through these symptoms and things like that, please understand that there are more than one way of looking at these things, and they often can be turned into strengths. So, one difficult thing when diagnosing people with autism with additional diagnoses is that the autism diagnosis covers a wide variety of symptoms that can overlap with other symptoms. And one of the criteria for any diagnosis is that the behaviors can't be explained by another diagnosis. So if you do, for example, have a diagnosis of autism and anxiety, the anxiety has to be so severe that it's worthy of an additional diagnosis since anxiety is already included in part of the symptoms associated with autism. So let's go on to look at some other diagnoses that are related. One diagnosis that is new in the new diagnostic criteria uh, manual is social pragmatic communication disorder. This is a lot like autism, except for there isn't the sensory issues and things like that. It's more just about communication and social skills. The next diagnosis I want to briefly touch on is sensory processing disorder. So this doesn't have the social skills or the communication issues. This just has the sensory issues. So you'll meet people with those diagnoses as well. The great thing that you'll hear me say over and over in this presentation is that all of these diagnoses that I'm discussing are extremely responsive to ABA therapy. There's so much research supporting that the techniques we use in ABA therapy are effective in treating all of these diagnoses. So we'll go through more of the treatments as I continue with the different diagnoses. So the next one I want to talk about is anxiety, just because this one I think is the most common thing we see dually diagnosed with autism. Anxiety often runs in the family. There's a genetic component there. And so we see this consuming our kids quite a bit, and having it limit them in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to go through and describe the diagnostic criteria for anxiety. Um, the child or adult has to have excessive worry most of the day. They have to have a hard time controlling the worry. So if someone says, you need to relax, you need to not worry about it, that's going to be really, really difficult for someone who meets the criteria for an anxiety diagnosis. They need to frequently feel restless or like they're on edge. The anxiety should make it difficult for them to concentrate, increase their irritability, muscle tension, tight shoulders, headaches, stomach aches sometimes. It can cause sleep issues as well. And it needs to be so significant that it really impairs their functioning. I think every human being struggles with a little bit of anxiety, and that's normal and healthy. It helps us prevent bad things from happening. But if your worry or anxiety is so excessive that it prevents you from living your life effectively, if it's limiting you socially or at school or at work, then that's when it gets to be more of a problem and less of a useful piece of protection for you. So, in addition to the anxiety disorder, there's a few other disorders related to anxiety that are worth noting. There's social anxiety disorder, which many of our kids struggle with being anxious socially, which makes sense. If they feel like they have deficits and they don't know how to interact with their peers, they might get nervous, and that's okay. But when it becomes a problem is when that fear becomes so powerful that they can't interact. They refuse to interact. They want to isolate and never talk to anyone. That's where it becomes more of a clinical issue. The next one is phobias. This is where there's something specific that they're afraid of. It could be they're afraid of squirrels or birds or small places. It could be any number of things that they have a phobia about. But if it's severe enough that it's limiting their functioning and getting in the way of their life, then it can meet the criteria for the diagnosis and definitely needs treatment. So the last one related to anxiety that I want to talk about in this category is panic disorder. So perhaps those of you listening to this have experienced a panic attack before. And so this is something that some of our clients struggle with as well. And this can be pretty severe. If you don't know what's happening, you might feel like you're dying, or it's an extremely overwhelming feeling, overwhelming sense of panic. And sometimes it's unprovoked, sometimes it comes out of the blue. And so it can be unexpected and it's hard to plan for, and it can be pretty limiting to individuals who struggle with this a lot. So that is something that would need addressing as well. The great thing about ABA is we have a ton of research supporting that our methods work. So that's the most common way that we address anxiety is through exposure therapy. So what the research has shown is that the more exposure we have to something, the less fear we have about it. So if you're afraid of driving on the highway, for example, and then you never drive on the highway, typically that fear will grow. You not being exposed to that fear allows it to stay large, and to whatever thoughts that you have about what bad thing could happen, you not exposing yourself to that keeps that fear alive. Where if you go on the highway and you're safe and you don't get in car accidents and it's a general positive experience, over time you would get over that fear. If you are exposed to really punishing things, when you're exposing yourself to your fear, then that's not going to be as effective. So what we do in therapy is we set up situations to help kids address their fears in a way that is not super stressful. And so sometimes we do what's called systematic desensitization, where we work our way up to it. So a common fear of kids in our program is fear of dogs. And so we commonly will work up to that. So at first it's pictures of dogs, then it's videos of dogs, then it's looking at dogs in the distance, then it's finding really nice dogs that they can pet for like a second and then run away and then come back and pet it again until they're finally comfortable. So, so fear is something that works really, really well to get rid of if we can do exposures. So a common opposite method that people try is avoidance, and I strongly recommend not doing that. If there's a fear in place, it needs to be faced, and if you need to build up to it, that's okay. But avoiding the fear will make it so it doesn't go away. And we want your child to be able to cope with their fears, face their fears, challenge their fears, so that fear doesn't limit them. So the next diagnosis I want to talk about is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. This is a fairly new diagnosis as well, and if a child has this in addition to autism, they're going to have some very extreme reactions to events that include violence to self or others, breaking property, vulgar language, things like that, explosive responses to small things. This temper needs to be larger than what's age appropriate. It needs to occur more than 3 times a week, and they need to be generally irritable a lot of the times. So this pattern has to occur for at least 12 months or more in multiple settings. And a person can only be diagnosed with this between the ages of 6 and 18. So treatment for this is going to be very similar to treatment for autism in general, in that we're teaching regulation skills, we're teaching tolerance skills. Part of how we teach tolerance skills is exposure. So we talked about that with anxiety. Exposure and repetition is really important for getting over these things. So we want to expose these kids to things that would typically cause them to have a tantrum. And then we want to work through the tantrum with them and teach them the skills that they need to be able to cope with that and to be able to calmly handle those things. So this diagnosis has a lot of tantrums that are pretty severe and disruptive. So this is a really important one to seek treatment for. The next one is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So again, this is something that's really common with people with autism, but in order to get this diagnosis, it has to, in addition to the autism diagnosis, it has to be really extreme. So when somebody has obsessive compulsive disorder, this doesn't just mean that they want to wash their hands a lot. This means that there's so much anxiety and stress around feeling the need to do these things that it really impairs their life. So there is an underlying belief that they have to do this thing to prevent something bad from happening. And if they can't do it, it provides a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety for them. A lot of times these compulsions will actually end up hurting them or definitely impairing their life in some way. And so they have to be pretty extreme. They have to get in the way of social, school, work, things like that in order to meet the diagnosis. But you're going to hear this over and over again. Treatment for it that's the most effective is exposure. So again, we have to expose people to their fear of not fulfilling the compulsion, and then we have to give them coping skills to deal with that stress. Through the repetitive exposure, they learn that what they feared would happen doesn't really happen. And through the regulation training, they learn how to stay calm even though they don't feel good about not being able to give into their compulsion. And so the more repetition we get of this, the easier it is for them to handle this and the better they cope till eventually it's not stressful at all. So, a lot of the therapy that we're talking about for these diagnoses are going to be based in exposure and repetition, and then skill training, a lot of times in regulation. So you're going to see therapy purposely exposing kids to different things that stress them out or that they're fearful of to help them learn how to cope with that. I love using Temple Grandin as an example because she talks about how she would have panic attacks. She was afraid to go to the store. She did not want to leave. But her mom made her. And she talks about how grateful she is for that because even though she was having panic attacks and she didn't want to and she was fearful, her mom was willing to push through that and help her learn how to cope so that now Temple is the successful person that she is today. So please know that these therapy techniques are done in compassion, and it's because we want your child to be as high functioning as possible. We want them to be able to hold down a job, live on their own, have relationships, not live in isolation, not have tantrums all the time. And if we protect them from the things that stress them out, if we remove all of the stressful things from their life, we are doing them a disservice, and they will not learn the coping skills that they need to deal with those things if we're constantly removing those things from their life. Rather, if we can expose them to it and give them the tools to learn how to deal with it, we can open up their life and we can help them live a life that isn't limited by fear and anxiety. So, when you see us working on that kind of stuff, know it's done from a place of compassion. The next diagnosis I would like to talk about is ADHD. This is a really common diagnosis that we see partnered with autism. And what you're going to see with ADHD is a lot of impulsivity. There might be careless mistakes, fail to pay attention to details, difficulty staying focused even on preferred activities. So a distinction here I want to point out is that if the child doesn't focus well on non-preferred activities, but they focus really good on preferred activities, this wouldn't meet the criteria. This struggling with focus needs to be across all activities. Additional symptoms: doesn't listen when spoken to directly, or at least doesn't seem to, doesn't follow through on instructions, they maybe start but then lose focus, or get distracted even before they start, has difficulty organizing tasks and activities, avoid tasks that require mental energy, distracted by external sounds, noises, visual type things, is forgetful about daily activities. For the hyper piece of it, not everybody is diagnosed with the hyper piece of it. You can be diagnosed with just the attention deficit, or you can be diagnosed with the attention and the hyper side of ADHD. So if they have the hyper side, it includes a lot of fidgeting, leaving the seat when expected to be seated, running and climbing when it's inappropriate, unable to engage in activities quietly, acts as if they're always on the go, talks excessively, blurts out answers prematurely, difficulty waiting turns, interrupting, intruding in people's conversations, things like that. So if you have a child diagnosed with ADHD, the only way that changes treatment outside of typical autism treatment is just that we're going to make our contingencies more immediate. So the research shows us that kids with ADHD can't wait 2 weeks for a prize or a month for a prize that they're earning. They need more direct contingencies to change their behavior. So you're going to see a lot of incentive systems. You're going to see a lot of contingencies set up. First you do this, then you do that. You might have visual schedules or different ways to prompt them and keep them on task. So one thing that's really important to note as a parent of somebody who has an autism or an ADHD diagnosis, when they're not following through, when they're not listening, is not an act of rebellion. This is an authentic, innocent thing that they struggle with. And so it can be frustrating as a parent when you tell your child to do something and then they don't listen, and you've told them maybe 2 or 3 times and they still haven't done it because on the way there something was shiny, or there was a bird that flew by, or suddenly they saw their favorite toy and they completely forgot what you said. So just know that that it's not a rebellious thing. It's an authentic struggle that they have. And oftentimes, as they get older, this is frustrating for them. And so, treatment for how to help them includes, like I said, a lot of those contingencies and reward systems, but then also something called executive functioning training. So, your prefrontal cortex is in the front of your brain. It's what controls all the symptoms related to ADHD. So, to help develop your prefrontal cortex, we're going to do activities with your child that include organizational skills, prioritizing skills, just helping them to regulate, helping them to figure out how to structure their life to compensate for some of those deficits. And now with smartphones and things like that, it really makes the adult with ADHD's life way easier, because you can put 1,000 reminders in your phone and all these things, and they can help you stay on track and help hold you accountable. So we try to equip kids with these tools so that they can manage their symptoms, and they can make it so that ADHD affects them as minimally as possible. The next thing I would like to talk about is depression. So this is more common with our older kids. Sometimes when someone with autism is high functioning enough to be aware of their social skills deficits, it can lead to depression. And so the way some people have described it to me is they see themselves as different, and they see themselves as not as good as their peers socially, and so then they feel lonely. Or if they don't have an easy time developing friendships, they might feel isolated, and all these things can lead to depression. And so a major part of the therapy we do is trying to get people with autism to see the strengths in it, and to see their own personal strengths of why they add value to this world, and why their specific life matters, and why they have so much to contribute. And an autism diagnosis does not limit their ability to have a really big impact on this world. And so, we work really hard to help our kids and young adults see their value and see their worth and see how they can contribute. And so, sometimes this is in small ways. Like, for example, we have different groups that we run, and we have maybe some of the older kids helping the younger kids. And so these kind of activities can help increase self-esteem because they're contributing, they're helping. It makes them feel good that they're able to help another person. Additionally, we do self-esteem journals where we work on getting kids to see their own strengths. Sometimes we go through workbooks where we have kids identify their strengths and their skills, and how we can use those skills to benefit their life or benefit other people's lives. And we also try to normalize for them that everybody has deficits. I have deficits. Every person alive has things that they struggle with, and that's normal, and that's part of being human. And so we really want to get the stigma away from any diagnosis, and helping them see that how in some ways they have advantages, and they have strengths that other people wish they'd have. So depression is something that commonly comes up. Another thing along the lines of depression is suicide. This comes up fairly often in one of two ways. Sometimes it comes up in an attention-seeking way, and other times it comes up in a legitimate, authentic, suicidal desire. And so it's really, really important that if a child or young adult talks about suicide, that it gets addressed. And so a lot of times I recommend um, to not thoroughly talk about it in the moment. So some of our kids know that if they say that they want to kill themselves or you don't love me or statements like that, that'll get a response. And sometimes this is a attention-seeking behavior. Sometimes they use it to escape things that they don't want to do. So if we sit down and have a 20-minute conversation about them, about their value, and why they shouldn't feel suicidal and why they should feel so good about themselves, this is really going to reinforce that problem behavior. But at the same time, comments like that cannot be dismissed. We do not want to take the risk that we assumed it was attention seeking when it was an authentic expression of how they're really feeling. So after the moment is over, after they've completed their task, then we go back to it and we talk to them and we say, hey, what's going on? Why are you talking, making statements like that? Is that how you feel? Would you really do that? And we ask those questions to make sure that they're not really struggling and that they're in an okay place. And so this is where we would refer to a mental health counselor if we had some serious concerns about suicide and things like that for them. Super important that we would monitor them. Sometimes there can be confusion on what that means. And so they'll make statements like that and they won't really understand the permanence of death. And so sometimes they just need an educational piece to describe to them what it really means and why that's not something they'd actually want. So that's an important thing that we need to address and be aware of and stay on top of. So, and additionally, anytime our therapists hear something like that, we ask that they tell their leads about it too, so that the lead is in the loop and can be monitoring it as well to make sure our kids are safe and that we're not going to miss any signs and symptoms. So the last diagnosis I'd like to talk about is ODD, which stands for Oppositional Defiant Disorder. This sometimes is diagnosed along with autism, and it includes often losing their anger, being touchy, easily annoyed, angry, resentful, argues with authority figures, defies or refuses to follow through, deliberately annoys others, never takes ownership for their own actions but blames other, and is generally vindictive. So OCD can be tough from the perspective of any authority figure is an automatic trigger. And so any demand that you give is likely to be met with defiance. And so typically our treatment looks a little different than typical autism treatment because we really increase the number of choices. We try to give them a sense of control to decrease that defensiveness. And then we heavily reward behavior that is compliant and agreeable. So we're teaching them regulation skills. Again, we're doing the exposure therapy that I talked about in a lot of the other diagnoses, but we're going to go at it at a much slower rate to avoid that defensiveness. Because if you get in a willpower battle with somebody with an ODD diagnosis, chances are they'll win. And so we want to avoid that. And so, that's why we build up to it. We give choices. We try to give them a sense of control. And then as we gain success with having them have appropriate, kind behaviors, we increase those demands slowly. And so eventually we get them to a point where they can handle that and they can stay regulated. And then that's how we work through that. But sometimes it takes quite the process and it takes a little extra patience and some outside of the box thinking. but we usually can get through to them. So, those are all the diagnoses I wanted to talk about today. They're the most common that we deal with. There's many other diagnoses as well that get diagnosed along with autism. But again, to reiterate, ABA therapy works with all of those diagnoses. And so the biggest thing we do is exposure and repetition, partnered with teaching skills to help them cope with those symptoms. And so sometimes people ask about the value of going and getting a child evaluated to see if they have an additional diagnosis. And you're welcome to do that if you're suspecting that your child has, one of these diagnoses or something else. But it does, like, knowing that your child has that label wouldn't necessarily change therapy from the perspective of we are going to be addressing those symptoms whether or not we know the label. So if we see that a child is displaying oppositional defiant disorder symptoms, we're automatically going to go into the treatment mode associated with those symptoms. We don't need to know that the child has that diagnosis officially in order to start down that treatment path. So some people like the diagnosis. They like to know what the labels are associated with their child's symptoms, and that's totally a personal decision. So either way, as long as your treatment team is really thorough and really in tune with your child, they're going to be on top of these symptoms and they're going to be adapting therapy accordingly to match what your kid needs in order to be effective with them. But again, thankfully, ABA is really effective in treating all of these diagnoses. So we can work through those things and help those deficits turn into strengths for your child. All right, thank you so much.